Every Republican in this room knows Joe Biden won the election fair and square. Everyone. Everyone knows that Donald Trump perpetrated the big lie. But unfortunately, it seems the price of admission in today's Republican Party is silence in the face of provable lies. Lies that right now are poisoning our democracy and exciting a plague of voter suppression.
Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer blasting Republicans for their fealty to the big lie as the Senate committee took up the Democrats' landmark voting reform bill. It's a sign of just how high the stakes are for both parties. Both Senators Schumer and McConnell were in attendance today. McConnell pushing back against the bill by pointing to a record turnout in 2020 and claiming, quote, "Our democracy is not in crisis." A stunning statement to make at the scene of the crime, literally, the Capitol insurrection, when a mob of Trump supporters stormed the Capitol, fueled by the big lie, the very same big lie Republicans are now using as a basis for passing voting restriction laws all across the country. We're back with Tim, Jason, and Claire. Claire, I was so desperate to go to you after listening to Chuck Schumer. Nothing he said there is wrong, but what's so surreal, and I wonder what it's like in the room, the Republicans know nothing's wrong in what he said, too. How do they play that off?
Well, I missed it. Did Mitch McConnell in his opening statement reference the fact that those record number of voters elected Joe Biden, or did he leave that part out? I'm willing to bet he left that part out. Listen, this is stacking up to be quite the partisan fight. I watched a lot of the hearing today, and there was a number of things were very unusual. You don't see so many party line votes when you have markups in committee. Invariably in markups in committee, there are people who jump the line and go back and forth on various amendments. And with relatively few exceptions, Mitch McConnell held his caucus to no on everything, even those amendments that would have in some ways moved the bill towards an area that I think would make many Republicans more comfortable. They are rejecting everything, even though, I mean, the manager's amendment that Amy Klobuchar offered was listening to some of the requests of election officials around the country that wanted more flexibility. It was, loosening some of the timelines. But no, all the Republicans voted no. And I'll tell you what was the most unusual thing I saw. Mitch McConnell stuck around. You don't see the leaders of the party in committee hearings. That never happens. They are both ex officio members of this committee as the leaders of their party. He stuck around all afternoon. I mean, I turned it on like at 2 o'clock here, and he was still talking about amendments that were being offered. He is saying to his caucus, okay, folks, I'm the pole in the tent. You're going to follow me, and we are going to defeat this bill no matter what. And I think now it's going to be up to the Democrats to fashion a bill they can get through the Senate on a party line vote.
And if they need to reform the filibuster, should they do that, Claire?
Well, first of all, reforming the filibuster is going to be harder. I mean, with all due respect, I mean, Joe Manchin is a problem, no question about it. But a lot of these, just one-off lines about Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema is a co-sponsor of this bill. There are a lot more people that have problems with doing away with the filibuster than just Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. There are other people in the caucus that would like to see reform as a first step, not an abolishment as a first step. So all of this is going to, if in fact they block this bill on a party line vote, then that will feed the impetus to do more in terms of filibuster. But there's ways to make this bill palatable to both parties. Mitch McConnell's just having none of it. And frankly, I think he's just going to encourage more of our folks to go vote. It's pretty obvious what the Republicans want. The Republicans don't want anybody who's poor to vote.
Well, and they don't, I mean, and Jason, this is, I've talked about this as sort of my time on the other side. It's existential to Republicans. I know exactly why Mitch McConnell is there. This is all they have, because this bill is like the COVID vaccine, right? It prevents 100% of the laws making, I think there are 368 of them, according to the Brennan Center, making their way through 47 states. This law would protect voters from all those laws. It would basically nullify efforts to roll back access to voting, which are based on a lie. So says the Republicans, Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, so say other Republicans behind closed doors. But I wonder if you could just articulate how you see the stakes and how you see this going.
So I'm not overly optimistic because I'm usually not. But what I do think is that this is the fight that leads to the real fight. Yeah, this is the fight that leads to the real fight because, you know, Biden set the strategy right. Look, we got to get this COVID relief bill out so that people like us. But now we're at the brass tacks. Now we're at the point where we have to do something about voting laws or all of our jobs are at risk. And while I don't know that I think this bill in any functional form is going to get through, if it fails, as Claire sort of mentioned, this is the catalyst. This is where you can sit down and say, look, everybody has this false position out there of like, well, we don't want to abolish the most people don't want to abolish the filibuster, but they want to reform the filibuster so that you actually have to stand up there and fight for it the way Ted Cruz did a couple years ago. And I thought that that has always been on the table, and a failure of this bill might actually move people forward. And this is why this matters. This isn't just a matter of controlling the House or controlling the Senate next year. We're talking about laws that are so draconian. You will see percentages, 3, possibly 5% of people in certain counties who simply won't be able to vote anymore in this country, who won't have access to the ballot. And the Republicans have basically said, look, the only way we can win this basketball game is if we lower the basket to 5 feet for us and make the Democrats shoot rocks and boulders into the basket, right? Like they pretty much said we can't win this game if it's remotely fair. But I think the Democrats are now in a position where they can say, look, everybody knows this is the most important issue going forward. We already have bad census information. We already have the economy working in our way. If we can't pass this, if this is not worth filibuster reform, then we might as well all go home next year. And I think this might be the fight that's the beginning of the battle that, quite frankly, will define the entire Biden presidency.
Tim Miller, the voting restriction the fight at the federal level has to also sort of be observed and covered with the backdrop of the crazy stuff going on in states like Arizona, where just today the Arizona legislature passed a law to purge infrequent mail voters. Now, in other words, infrequent mail voters are people who usually vote in presidential years, but not specials, not midterms, and they tend to be more Democratic voters, frankly, than Republican voters who are infrequent voters. Here's what the bill would do. Senate Bill 1485 in Arizona would require county officials to remove voters from the permanent early voting list who do not vote early at least once in a primary, general, or municipal election during 2 election cycles. Democrats say that more than 125,000 voters would have been removed from the permanent early voting list ahead of the last election had the law been in place at the time. 3 of 4 Arizona voters are on the list. So again, this is this surgical approach to the states that President Biden won in close elections to make sure that the gains made by Democrats are not repeated.
Yeah, look, and it's happening all over the country. And these reviews of the election are. I keep learning about new ones every day. New Hampshire and Michigan. It's not just Arizona where they're still going back over the 2020 big lie. These changes are the main legislative issue. It's what the Koch brothers and others are pushing in a lot of these state legislatures. So something does have to be done now. But here's my issue just from a strategic standpoint, though. The best thing that the Democrats can do to get good election reform passed and to guarantee that the next election isn't stolen is to do well in 2022. Because with Joe Manchin there, it just isn't going to happen. It's just reality. It just isn't going to happen. And so the Democrats and Joe Biden need to stick with popular issues, continue to force the Republicans to vote down and stand in the way of popular issues. That is partly some of his spending policies that we've been talking about, but it's also on this. I wish the Democrats would try to rally behind some election day being a holiday. Automatic voting, automatic registration for voters, something tangible and popular that the country can get behind. Make Republicans vote that down. I do think this For the People Act is jammed with like every left-wing interest group's favorite thing. And there's important stuff in there, and then there's some not so important and some kind of crazy stuff in there. And so I think that the Democrats need to have their eye on the ball of winning in 2022, of forcing the Republicans to on this issue, of exposing their anti-democratic bent that the party's gone down. That's an understatement, and that is probably the best path forward. Jason
Tim,
doesn't agree with
Jason,
me
and
on
Claire are all.
Again, I got to say.
Let him jump into the next
Tim,
one.
no.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just say, Tim, everybody already knows what the Republicans are. They literally led a march to the Capitol, and not the civil rights kind, like a couple months ago. Everybody knows what the Republican Party is. There's no thing in exposing them anymore. And quite frankly, if they don't make this the #1 priority, you can't wait until the 2022 elections. Because if these laws stay on the books in 2022, Democrats will lose the House and Senate, and they will impeach Joe Biden in February of 2023. I promise you, that's what the Republicans will do. So, like, no, you can't wait for a year and a half and hope that this works in a functional politics sort of way, because we're beyond functional politics. When you have Josh Hawley's and Ted Cruz's world saying, well, I don't really know if an insurrection where they were calling for the death of my colleagues is something that makes you unqualified to be in elected office anymore, you're way past campaign management. This is about saving this country.